Thanks everybody for coming to our third of this summer's Historic Trails Speaker Series, which is co-sponsored by the Museum at the Portage. And so, as I think all of you are well familiar, this summer our focus has been trails for this series, and thinking about trails not just as routes in the ground, which Portage was, the Fox River right there, Wisconsin River right there, ancient trail connecting it to, and trails extending from here all throughout Wisconsin. So Portage has a big physical trails history, which has been part of the focus. But also, more than that with this series, is looking at the trails experiences of the people groups involved in this history. And so, our first speaker talked about the trail experiences, the experiences of path through life circumstances faced by the immigrants coming to Wisconsin in the 1830s to 1850s. Today we're going to look at probably the most important trail experience to this particular site's history, which is the story of how Ho-Chunk people navigated the path through life circumstances during an era when there were efforts to erase their presence in Wisconsin. I might call it kind of a Trail of Tears story for the Ho-Chunk, which, similar to the Trail of Tears that we're familiar with, we read about in school, like the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but very specific to the circumstances that the Ho-Chunk Nation in particular was facing here in Wisconsin, so a bit different too. So we're excited to hear about it from Dr. Stephen Kantrowitz, history professor at UW-Madison, who recently published a book on this topic. So we're excited to hear from you.
All right. Quick recording. Well, thanks for that. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm really happy to be here. I haven't had a chance to speak here before, and so it's a real pleasure. And it's been really nice to walk around the grounds a little bit and see some of the exhibits outdoors. So anyway, let me tell you about the trail of the evening, which indeed we could call the Ho-Chunk Trail of Tears. And this is based on the book that I published last year, Citizens of a Stolen Land, A Ho-Chunk History of the 19th Century United States. I should say that I do not come to this history, I think pretty obviously, as a member of Ho-Chunk Nation, and I didn't come to this history as a specialist in Native American history, or in the history of the Midwest, or the history of Indian removal. I was hired at the University of Wisconsin 30 years ago to be the Civil War guy. And I spent the first 20 or so years of my career at UW doing just that. Doing books on the history of white supremacy in Reconstruction, on the history of black activism and abolition in the 19th century North, and feeling that was the area in which my career was going to proceed. And then, about 12 years ago, sitting in my backyard on the east side of Madison, please call first, a colleague who was a specialist in Native American history, who was sitting around after an event having a beer with us, said, well, this whole neighborhood is built on effigy mounds. And I sort of knew what an effigy mound was because this one survives in the park around the corner from our house. But I didn't realize that the whole neighborhood had been, at one point, not very long ago, about 100 years ago, filled with them. And that in fact, the Four Lakes, Dejope, Madison, had 1,000 or more mounds within the relatively recent past. Most of them destroyed by development or by agriculture, but many of them extant, including some on the UW campus, and many in other parks around the city. And as I began to dig into this and ask this question, as so often when one does this, the whole world started to take on a slightly different shape for me. Because I realized, what I should have known, of course, as an American historian, that the history of the place that I lived, and the place I was born, in the United States, and the place that presumably all of us live now, the United States, was not very long ago and for a very long time before that, somebody else's homeland, every square foot of it. That realization, which had played virtually no role in my education as a historian from high school through college, through the PhD, and on into my career, and had been intermittently, the sort of drum that one or another of my colleagues had banged in one or another places, and that I had mostly ignored. That started to feel pretty silly to me, a little ridiculous and a little shameful, honestly. And so in trying to explore what these mounds were and who had made them and where they came from, and just a little bit of digging turned into a lot more digging until I discovered up in the Historical Society archives in Madison that 100 years before me, a colleague on campus, Charles Brown, then the state archaeologist, had come to exactly the same realization and had spent his career trying to reconstruct the native history of Wisconsin, and had done so in a series of surveys of landowners and explorations and digs and mapping and a million other things, including relationships with elders among various tribes in Wisconsin, and had by the 1920s produced this atlas of native Wisconsin, the Charles Brown Atlas, in which, it's a little hard to see here, but it covers the whole state. If we laid it out, it's the 1923 property plat of the state, I believe. If you laid it out, it would more than fill this room. And it's township by township level survey of the state. And so you can see every Indian village, trail, campsite, archaeological site, workshop, and mound group in the state that Brown had a record of, and he was pretty thorough. And this is just a joke. This is just the Four Lakes region here. And actually, there's another level of the map that takes us even to a higher level of resolution, but I'll spare you that for now. And all of which is just to say that I realized that for a long time, non-Ho-Chunk people had been trying to reconstruct the Ho-Chunk past and present in Wisconsin, but that the resources have not always been available for people to exchange that information easily among scholars and between scholars and non-scholars. And that's why I wrote this book. And I wrote it in part in collaboration and in consultation with members of the Ho-Chunk community in Madison, with my scholarly community more broadly. In the course of it, I tried to learn some Ho-Chunk. I did very poorly, but I did make an effort to take some Ho-Chunk classes on campus. And I cannot pretend in any way, shape, or form to be an expert in Ho-Chunk culture. I am not that. But I know enough to know what I don't know, and I know enough to know, as I think I'll point out a couple of times tonight, what Indian agents and politicians and observers could not see in the 19th century, especially as they were encountering the Ho-Chunk. It caused them to misunderstand a lot of what they were seeing and doing. At the core of what I want to talk about tonight and what I talk about in the book is this question. Between the late 1820s and the late 1830s, the United States, which in 1825 had identified this entire territory as belonging to the Ho-Chunk people, the United States seized all of that territory in more or less fraudulent or coerced treaties. Despite that fact, and that led to an odyssey of deportation, expulsion, removal, and trauma that went on for 40 years across the Great Plains. Despite this history, Ho-Chunk people still live in their ancestral homeland, and many of them are citizens of Ho-Chunk Nation today. So that begs a little explanation. How is it that people who, formally speaking, lost title to their entire homeland continue to have a legal claim in their homeland today? That's the story that I'm going to try to unpack today as part of this theme of trails. The Ho-Chunk people's ancestral homeland, as identified by their Department of Cultural Heritage, extended all the way down to St. Louis, through Door County, to the Twin Cities, across the Mississippi River. Of course, parts of this were shared and used in common by a variety of peoples, not just by the Ho-Chunk. But all of this would be territory in which Ho-Chunk villages, seasonal encampments, hunting parties, trading parties would be found over many hundreds of years. Ho-Chunk family and community in the early 19th century was quite extensive and decentralized. Ho-Chunk people lived in 40 or more distinct villages, also called bands, because they were also somewhat migratory, across the territory that I've just identified. Though separated formally into bands, actually had very close relationships with one another through kinship and trade, and through the Ho-Chunk clan structure. Every Ho-Chunk person is born into one of 12 patrilineal clans. Those are central to people's obligations to the community and their place in the community. But this world was powerfully disrupted by both American settlers' land hunger and very specifically, initially, by their lead hunger. Lead was the strategic commodity of the early 19th century. It was, to that era, what uranium or steel was to the 20th century, something you could not do without if you were going to be a military power. And so a place with a lot of lead in it was a place you could make a big profit. And although the United States had recognized the Ho-Chunk people's title to the entirety of that lead district in southwestern Wisconsin, American squatters began entering the territory very quickly after that treaty, laying claim to the lands, getting into conflicts with Ho-Chunk people about those spurious claims to the land, and a series of land pirates, vigilantes, local regional warlords moved into the territory and tried to push the Ho-Chunk out of the lead diggings. They did so successfully that they became the military and political leaders of the territory and then of the state of Wisconsin. And so the story I've told you could be told under other names because some of you know it, because you know one of the chief actors in it. Henry Dodge was one of those land pirates and squatters and vigilantes who entered the territory without legal claim to it, solely on the basis of his desire to make money in that territory, and against the federal government's treaties with the Ho-Chunk people, and pressed that claim through force so successfully that he was able to establish himself the leader of a vigilante gang that got ratified as an arm of the U.S. Army, and a would-be political leader who became the territorial governor.
Wow.
So it's important, I think, to call things by their proper names. And so
we're adults here. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. So the first of the major treaties of land cession is the Treaty of 1829, in which the federal government ratifies the theft of the lead diggings by Dodge and other squatters. And that treaty is imposed upon the Ho-Chunk in 1829. Over the next few years, events unrelated to the Ho-Chunk, but very much related to American land piracy and settlement farther south, here along the Mississippi River in Illinois, comes to fruition when a group of Sauk and other Indians refuse their removal across the Mississippi River, return into their old villages in Illinois. This is Black Hawk's band, and are chased out of their villages by the Illinois militia and by vigilantes. They move from there up the Rock River into the Ho-Chunk homeland. And indeed, what we call the Black Hawk War mostly takes place in the Ho-Chunk homeland. My colleague Libby Tronis at Bradley University, one of our former PhD students, argues pretty persuasively that during this conflict, the Ho-Chunk play mainly a peacekeeping role, trying desperately to keep the United States and its forces and the Black Hawk's band apart, knowing that if they come into serious conflict with one another in the Ho-Chunk homeland, on Ho-Chunk territory, that the U.S. will use that as a pretext to seize that territory. And they almost succeed in hiding Black Hawk's band and keeping them and the U.S. forces apart. But as we know, that strategy finally fails. The U.S. figures out where Black Hawk's band is, gives it chase all the way across south central Wisconsin through what's now the UW campus, past basically through my backyard, and across the UW campus, and in a series of battles and finally massacres on the Mississippi River, defeats Black Hawk's effort to escape. After this conflict, we have to imagine thousands of Illinois and U.S. forces on the ground in this territory. No longer by that point Abraham Lincoln, he had mustered out, but several other future presidents and military leaders were on the ground here.
Stephen, be documenting this in your book, all of it, this.
Yes. After the war, with forces on the ground, the United States demands further cession of land from the Ho-Chunk. And they take the eastern remaining third of the Ho-Chunk territory, including what's now the city of Madison, from the Ho-Chunk in that treaty. The treaty commissioners, in their record of their deliberations with the Ho-Chunk, say, this treaty is made on the blended grounds of conquest and contract. And not even, again, call things by their proper names. This is, the Ho-Chunk understand they cannot resist this treaty with all the U.S. military force on the ground in their homeland that exists. This is the beginning of the period of sustained hardship for the Ho-Chunk people, because the Treaty of 1832 insists that they move north of the Wisconsin River into the remaining third of their homeland, or west of the Mississippi River into a territory I'll show you shortly called the neutral ground. But in any case, out of the area of the main part of the Ho-Chunk population prior to the Black Hawk War. And this begins the period of extended hunger and starvation, including the witnessed by the Kinseys here at the Agency House in the 1830s. The United States moves into Wisconsin in this moment, and in the aftermath of the Black Hawk War, makes this part of what had been the Michigan territory into the new Wisconsin territory. And it's worth thinking for a minute about the way that they're building their own state and imagining what their state should look like. First, the motto, Civilitas successit barbarum. Civilization takes the place of barbarism. And civilization here is represented by the yeoman farmer with his team plowing the land, American agricultural practices, institutions, sailing ships, steamships, and lighthouses, commerce and trade. And in the center of the drawing, looking west, a crudely drawn Indian figure being pressed west, presumably across the Mississippi River, out of the state, out of the territory of Wisconsin. This is a kind of vision of what the new order of things will be in this territory. Now, mind you, at this moment, the Ho-Chunks still have title to pretty substantial domain in western Wisconsin. Menominee and Ojibwe and Potawatomi and other people have title to many other parts of Wisconsin. So this is a wish, not yet a reality, but it's a sign of the U.S. policy. And that policy, put simply, is what we call removal, right? The policy of Indian removal as ratified by the Indian Removal Act of 1830, passed narrowly by Congress, but after that, not controversial. A policy that led to the dispossession, deportation, exile, not just of the Cherokee, the Trail of Tears that we all learned about in school, but of a dozen other people, more than a dozen other people, not just in the Southeast, but also here in the Old Northwest, the Midwest, who were exiled to new territories west of the Mississippi River in a broad domain then called Indian Territory, now parts of the states of Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. But then a kind of thought of or described as a permanent home for Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. As we know, that permanent home was permanent for about another half century at best. Removal, I guess I'm suggesting, is kind of a euphemism, and again, we've got to call things by their proper names. And dispossession and exile are big parts of it. Ethnic cleansing is not too strong a word for term for what we're witnessing here. But there are other features and forces at work, including the government's own policy of what it calls civilization. I guess first I just want to say there's a final treaty here in 1837, in a very kind of frank and uncomplicated act of extortion. The federal government withholds its annuities until the Ho-Chunk agree to cede the remaining part of their domain east of the Mississippi and to accept, at least nominally, their removal to west of the Mississippi to the neutral ground and into this territory here. After 1837, the Ho-Chunk have no formal title to any of their ancestral homeland east of the Mississippi River. And after 1840, the government begins very earnestly and repeatedly removing them by military force from areas east of the Mississippi into the neutral ground. But even the neutral ground is not meant to be a permanent home. The neutral ground is a kind of a way station. The federal government is imagining various different plans, including establishing a giant reservation up in Minnesota somewhere for lots of tribes together. Ultimately, what they end up doing is buying some land from the Ojibwe and trying to move the Ho-Chunk onto a reservation in central Minnesota at a place called Long Prairie. And here we begin to see a forking path in Ho-Chunk life. On the left here, a figure called Wakanja Herega, Roaring Thunder, sometimes known to Americans as Dandy or the Dandy, for reasons that the portrait may make plain. And he represents the forces who resist that further removal and insist on returning to Wisconsin or refuse to leave it at all. In fact, he rarely leaves Wisconsin during his entire life. Doesn't die until the late 1860s and remains in Wisconsin that entire time. I'm going to come back to him and the forces he represents in a little while. What I want to talk about right now is this fellow over here, Wakanja Guga, Coming Thunder Winishek, as he's known, who is the both accounted by the United States the sort of principal chief in treaty terms of the Ho-Chunk, but more importantly, a very respected and able political leader for the Ho-Chunk in their diaspora as they figure out how to negotiate and deal with the pressures coming upon them from the United States. Because those pressures are severe. There's a long forced march up the Mississippi River during which Wakanja Guga and his allies try desperately to come to some other accommodation. They try to make a separate treaty with a Dakota leader in order to gain territory along the Mississippi River, close to the Wisconsin homeland. They're only moved on by massive military force and threats on the part of the U.S. until they finally end up at the reservation at Long Prairie. There, they're subject to the U.S. policy of civilization, which imagines that they can be transformed into sort of cognates of American farmers. They can be taught to farm like Americans, to live in square wooden houses like Americans, to have their children learn English like Americans, to worship in Christian churches like Americans, etc., etc., etc. This is the policy of civilization. And they resist this policy. Very few actually are interested in learning English. They're interested in the school because the school provides rations to the children. They're interested in the houses because the houses have timber. They've got some interest in some parts of this toolkit, but not in the way that the Americans think they should be. And so there's a kind of ongoing struggle at Long Prairie about whether the Ho-Chunk will do as the Americans want and become the kind of people the Americans want them to become. And by and large, the answer is no. In fact, the Ho-Chunk won't even stay on the reservation at Long Prairie. They don't like, the territory is very unfamiliar to them. It's not the kind of landscape that we're familiar with here. It's more arid, it's less timbered, it's got, it doesn't have as good hunting. There's many things wrong with it from a Ho-Chunk perspective. So lots of them, including the man who the Americans call their principal chief, Wakanja Guga, spend a lot of the year outside the reservation, which drives the agents crazy, but they can't do anything about it. Otherwise, they'd have to garrison the whole reservation, and they don't have the force to do that. So eventually, by the early 1850s, they end up signing a new treaty with the Ho-Chunk for lands in southern Minnesota that are much more like this, that look much more like south central Wisconsin, and that are much more congenial with the Ho-Chunk, and that the Ho-Chunk actually want. And so in 1855, the Ho-Chunk moved to the Blue Earth Reservation in southern Minnesota, just outside the town of Mankato. The problem with this move is that it comes with a new treaty, and the new treaty comes with further stipulations about what the Ho-Chunk must do in order to become civilized in the way that the Americans want. And in 1855, and in another treaty extracted from the Ho-Chunk in 1859, which cuts that reservation in half, that policy of civilization is enforced. So much so that it says that the Ho-Chunk need to accept the division of their common lands into individual plots. And this, people like Kantrowitz, who live in a more traditional Ho-Chunk context, do not want and cannot abide. This is not the way that Ho-Chunk political economy works. It's not the way that Ho-Chunk social organization works. It's not the way that Ho-Chunk ideas of land tenure work. So the conflict emerges with the United States at Blue Earth very sharply in the 1850s, to the extent that in 1861, when the United States sends agents into the Blue Earth Reservation to survey the land in order to break it up into parcels for individual households, and to take a census of the tribe in order to know how many people, how many households, and who should get how much land. Well, Kantrowitz and his friends lead a resistance movement to the census and the survey. They, when the surveyor comes, they pull his stakes out of the ground and threaten to stick him with them if he doesn't leave the reservation. And when the census takers come, well, Kantrowitz and his friends go into the stockade where the census is taking place and push the Ho-Chunk out. The survey is a failure, so they have a very partial survey of the reservation, and the census is a failure. So they have only a very partial census. Nonetheless, they go forward with allotting lands to individual households, but it happens very slowly, only affects a few hundred people by the time the Civil War comes. At which point it's possible to imagine that the Ho-Chunk could delay this indefinitely, except that the Ho-Chunk are neighbors at Blue Earth with the Dakota. And the Dakota have had, if it's possible, even a harder time over the previous decade, because they have essentially been forced to give up the entirety of southern Minnesota and accept half of a tiny reservation along the Minnesota River. And by 1862, they're starving. In the summer of 1862, they go to war with the United States. This is the Great Sioux Uprising, or the U.S.-Dakota War, as we generally talk about it now, in which Dakota warriors actually press American settlement back out of Minnesota, out of southern Minnesota, for a period of weeks, until the U.S. Army and the territorial militia come in massive numbers much bigger than the Dakota Fighting Force, and defeat and imprison some Dakotas, send others fleeing across the west, where they'll be pursued for the next 5 years by U.S. Army outfits. And the Dakota are imprisoned in a concentration camp at Fort Snelling, and other places. But this leads to the military tribunals against against Dakota warriors, in which, in trials lasting sometimes 5 or 10 minutes, military courts, treating them as unlawful combatants, sentence them to death. The sentences must be reviewed by the president. They're reviewed by Lincoln, who commutes most of those death sentences, allows a little more than 39 sentences to stand. And on the day after Christmas, 1862, 38 Dakota men are hanged at a mass gallows in the center of Mankato, the largest mass execution in U.S. history. And in the months that follow, Dakotas are banished from Minnesota by state law and sent to a reservation far out on the Missouri River. The Ho-Chunk played almost no role in the US-Dakota War, but they are caught up in it nonetheless because they are on lands that the settlers want. And the anti-Indian hysteria of the US-Dakota War gives those settler forces the opportunity that they need to demand that the Ho-Chunk too be expelled from Minnesota, and they are. Congress passes a law which Lincoln signs, April of 1863. The Ho-Chunk are banished as well from Minnesota to Crow Creek Reservation out on the Missouri River, a barren and terrible place. In the course of that forced migration, hundreds of people die, and hundreds more die once they're deposited at Crow Creek. This is truly a catastrophic experience. Some scholars of this period and field say, at the point at which the US government knows that when you do a forced march in winter of hundreds of people, and you have repeated experience that this causes mass death, this in fact is genocide. Not every scholar agrees with that, but I think there's a powerful case to be made that that unwillingness to learn from experience when the cost is hundreds or even thousands of lives is in fact so negligent as to amount to that. The Ho-Chunk at Crow Creek, led again by Wakanja Guga and people like him, flee south down the Missouri River to friends and relations among the Omaha Indians, whose reservation is in what's now the Nebraska state of Nebraska, then not quite the Nebraska Territory. The U.S. government finally accepts that kind of flight, that refugee movement south away from Crow Creek, and in 1865 allows the Ho-Chunk to trade those lands at Crow Creek for lands in Nebraska. And that becomes the home of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska. That is that branch of the Ho-Chunk people, now their own autonomous sovereign Indian nation in the state of Nebraska. So this is one story of one branch of the Ho-Chunk people in this kind of cataclysmic moment of social transformation. But there's a second half to this story, and that's the half I suggested when I introduced you to Wakanja Cherega, to Roaring Thunder. This is a sort of oil sketch made of him by the brother of a U.S. Army officer, a painter named Charles Dease, when he went down the Frozen Rock River sometime about 1840. He went down the Frozen Rock River sometime about 1840. That means long past the treaties and past the moment that the U.S. government had started to actually use military force to force the Ho-Chunk out of Wisconsin, this guy was still in Wisconsin. And when Dease came back with this drawing, he liked it all right, but didn't think it was commercial enough. So he went to St. Louis and he dressed it up. Kind of Last of the Mohicans kind of romantic quality about it. This one is in the St. Louis Mercantile Library Museum, so he did something right? Fairly successful in that respect. But this is a real person. We know this for lots of reasons, but he continues to be a leader of the resistant bands of the Ho-Chunk. The Ho-Chunk bands who will not leave Wisconsin or will not stay removed from Wisconsin. This is him in Madison in 1863 after a parley with the governor, to which he'd been sort of invited in chains. But nonetheless, a parley that ends with him free and negotiating. This is one of many stories of Ho-Chunk people who found a way to navigate removal by staying in Wisconsin. One mode was Roaring Thunder's mode, which was to sort of stay at the outskirts of American settlement, keep moving the villages farther away from where the settlers were, do some incidental trading, do some back and forth, learn enough English to be able to make oneself understood and to do some negotiating, but stay out of the settlers' way. There's another way, though. And some of you may know about Blue Wing, Choga. He was another Ho-Chunk band leader who is the head of a very large extended family, decided in the 1850s that the answer to living in a settler state was to act like you were part of it, and to go to the land office and take out a patent on land as if one were a homesteader. And that's what he does. In this section of Reedsburg, and you can see on this map that the person identifying who owns what property, along with the schoolhouse and the Weston family and the rest, has written Indian Aha Choker on the map to indicate that these parcels are owned by Blue Wing. Sorry, these parcels are owned by Blue Wing. These three 40-acre parcels here. And so it looks like, and this is one of many cases like this, but it looks like Blue Wing has taken up a 40-acre homestead under the land office, just like a good American settler would, except this land has timber, this land has hunting, this land has a spring, and this land becomes the home to Ho-Chunk Village. What he's done is use the forms of American property ownership to reestablish a kind of cordon of safety around for hundreds of Ho-Chunk people. And indeed, hundreds of people move through this territory. And the settlers around nearby who think that, 40 acres, that's what, 5, 6, 8 people maybe. Like, they all claim to be members of his family. Now, what's fascinating about that is Ho-Chunk family, some of you may know this, Ho-Chunk family is much more extensive, much deeper than Anglo-American or Euro-American family structures. People whom, in my tradition, we would call first cousins are brother and sister, and understood in those terms. People who would be a maternal aunt or a paternal uncle are mother and father. And so family actually is extremely extensive in the Ho-Chunk world. And so this is not actually a fabrication or a ruse that the Ho-Chunk are using, but a description of their social reality. We are members of the same family, and we are members of the same band, and we are actually living in this Ho-Chunk village in the middle of settler society. That could be the basis for conflict, and indeed, Blue Wing's village does move at one point, but it moves closer to Reedsburg because they have trade relationships, and because there's this plot of land between the new railroad and the river that American settlers don't have any interest in. It's just the wrong kind of land. But it's a kind of a wetland, a kind of bottomland filled with the resources that Ho-Chunk people use, works perfectly. And so they stay there until later they move up into Monroe County, but that's another story. There are lots and lots of stories like this in 19th century Wisconsin of Ho-Chunk people using the terms of the settler state to do their own business. So, what do we see when we look at the Ho-Chunk world of, say, the 1860s, just after the Civil War? We have a fairly substantial Ho-Chunk population, maybe half of the Ho-Chunk world or a little more, in the new reservation in Nebraska. And we have another big population in the old homeland, having kind of found a foothold or restored a foothold in villages, always kind of at risk of being deported again, but still with substantial populations there. We have a third group, though, because the group at Blue Earth, though the process of civilization and allotment and the rest of that had been mostly unsuccessful, it had actually done some work. And especially Ho-Chunk people of mixed French and Ho-Chunk or American and Ho-Chunk descent had taken up allotments at Blue Earth. And though some of them were cast out with the rest of the tribe in 1863, some of them made the argument that they should be allowed to stay, and some of them were. And some of them volunteered for service in the United States Civil War Army and served in the ranks. And so at the end of the war, they were able to press claims for lands that they'd been promised and never received, or lands that had been unfairly taken from them, though allotted to them, in the early 1860s. And they shamed the U.S. Congress into giving them restitution, essentially, for the lands that they lost in that time. And this development comes at exactly the same moment as the United States is rewriting its Constitution to deal with the end of slavery, because this is, of course, the aftermath of the Civil War. And one of the ways that the United States government does this is by creating the 14th Amendment. which is ratified in 1868, but it's been debated in 1866, which includes this language here. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state in which they reside. That phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, is explicitly put there by the framers of this amendment to exclude members of native nations, who are not meant to be understood as citizens of the United States. They are citizens of their tribal nations, not of the United States. But this raises a very interesting question about the Ho-Chunk in Minnesota in this moment. Their tribal nation is in Minnesota, is in Nebraska. There's another bunch of Ho-Chunk who are nominally part of that tribal nation but are in Wisconsin. But these folks are in Minnesota and they're property holders, and some of them have served in the United States Army, and a lot of them speak English. In what sense are they subject to the jurisdiction of the tribe in Nebraska? In no sense at all. And so aren't they actually, under the terms of the 14th Amendment, citizens of the United States? Maybe? This is a moment of enormous optimism about what a non-racial or a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy could look like. This is a cartoon from Harper's Weekly in 1869 called Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner, which imagines a kind of polyglot, multiracial America as a place where come one, come all, free and equal. Really very radical and optimistic vision for its moment by a cartoonist who is not always radical or optimistic. And you can see to the extent that Uncle Sam's wife, the hostess here, you can identify by her sort of tiara here, is seated between the African-American man and the Chinese man, right? Neither of whom could have been contemplated as citizens of the United States before the Civil War. But both of them are now fully vested members of this kind of common table of United States self-government, universal suffrage, freedom and equality. And Thomas Nast, who made this cartoon, really wanted to include everybody. And you can tell, because look, he knew he somehow had to deal with the fact of Native Americans, but he didn't know how. Almost everybody else at the table is husband, wife, and baby, right? Domestic, a kind of figure of like, kind of heteropatriarchal domesticity that's so comfortable. Like everyone is comfortable with the idea of this. We're all the same, right? We all want the same things. Except this guy doesn't really fit, does he? Oops, sorry, I thought I had it blown up a little more. He's muddy, he doesn't have a family with him, some others don't, but he doesn't have a family with him. It's not clear at all how he fits, and neither Nast nor anybody else really understands how Native people are supposed to fit into this as Native people. Because they don't, in a certain way. But the optimism of this opening here, represented by this cartoon and by the 14th and 15th Amendments, of course, leads to a couple of things. One of which is the idea that the allottees in Minnesota, those Ho-Chunk who seem more or less like Americans, should be able to become Americans. And so they travel in 1870 and 1872 from the Blue Earth Reservation to the federal courthouse in St. Paul, Minnesota, where they are allowed to swear out certificates of naturalization as American citizens as though they were immigrants. And you can see here, Peter Harrison, who has declared his desire to become a citizen of the United States, with the competent testimony of two citizen witnesses who happen to be two Ho-Chunk people who swore out the same certificate 2 years before. And Peter Harrison, among about 160 other Ho-Chunk people, become citizens at the courthouse in St. Paul by exactly this method. At the same moment, settler forces in Wisconsin are saying enough is enough. We're filling up the state. We don't want the dirty Ho-Chunk here anymore, the dirty Winnebago here anymore. And they don't fit with our society, and we just don't like having them around. Among them, Frederick Jackson Turner's father, Andrew Jackson Turner, editor of newspaper up here. They begin an intensive process of agitating for the forcible removal of the Ho-Chunk again from Wisconsin in the early 1870s. And indeed, they get federal funds to do it. As this gears up, the Ho-Chunk are paying attention, and they begin going to talk to their allies in Portage and Reedsburg and Prairie du Chien and other places, the traders they work with, the lawyers they know, to try to figure out what they can do about this. And one of those lawyers sends a petition on their behalf to Washington in 1873 to protest against this incipient removal effort. This is Henry Lee here in Portage in 1873, enclosing a petition against the removal of the Winnebagos from Wisconsin, in which, kind of a kitchen sink petition here, with all kinds of different things, and 224 Ho-Chunk people signing or having their names listed and family members listed at the bottom. But some key elements of this, they further represent that each of them are sufficiently intelligent to control their own affairs. This is part of the rhetoric of citizenship and naturalization. That they are willing and anxious to make homestead claims or purchase real estate, so they want to fit in to the American order of property, and adopt the habits and customs of civilized life. So again, telling the Americans what they want to hear, and become citizens of the United States. There's a really powerful irony here, which is that the people signing this petition are the people who have been least interested in American property order, in American civilization, in the habits and customs of what the Americans call civilization. And yet, they have learned by observing their kindred around the diaspora that this is what works. This is how you get what you want. You say the words the Americans want you to say. And it works for two reasons. One reason is that the Americans don't know what they mean. They don't know what is civilization and how much of it is enough. How do you know when you're looking at a person if they're civilized or not? Does property ownership do it? Does speaking English do it? What does it? Nowhere have the Americans codified this. And so there's a huge gray area to play with. And the second reason takes us back again to the politics of the post-Civil War United States, which is that this is a moment of intense partisan conflict about that vision of a multiracial democracy. Because although Thomas Nast, who made that cartoon, and the Republicans coming out of the trajectory of Abraham Lincoln, in many parts of the North, believe that that's what should happen, and African Americans generally across the North and South are earnestly agitating for this, there is a huge constituency of the United States, including many former Confederates, and lots of Northerners, who don't believe that that's proper, who believe the United States has always been a white man's republic and should always be a white man's republic. One of those men is this guy, Senator Alan Thurman, a conservative Democrat from Ohio, who had supported the Civil War, but had been a foe of slave emancipation, a foe of Reconstruction, a foe of equal rights, also kind of an Indian hater, honestly, but mostly focused on the grave injustice being done to white Southerners by forcing them to accept black people as their equals. Thurman gets a hold of that petition, and he thinks, here is a stick to beat the radicals with, because they have forced non-racial citizenship on the South, but they're unwilling to accept even a couple of hundred Native Americans who they don't like as neighbors in Wisconsin. And he embarrasses the Wisconsin Republicans so badly on the floor of the U.S. Senate in the course of debating this removal bill and the funding for removing the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin, on the basis of their evident hypocrisy, that they are cowed into accepting an absurd stipulation in the removal legislation, which is that they are forbidden to use military force to do it. That is, they can use the military to escort people, but people have to go voluntarily. So what happens is that, of course, the military is not given those orders. The military is ordered to remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. And in the last days of 1873 and the early weeks of 1874, troops come down from Sparta and begin to round up the Ho-Chunk in the winter camps. And it's a bad time. People get put in boxcars and sent off to Nebraska without blankets, without food. Many more people die, again, in this forced migration in the winter of 1873. But as word of this gets out and comes back to Washington, it becomes a scandal. Because they did not have authority to round people up, to chain them up, and to force them west. And as soon as that becomes clear, the federal government gets a little queasy about it. Further, what happens is in places like Reedsburg and Portage, Ho-Chunk people like Blue Wing and his family have a lot of friends and neighbors who think of them as comfortable friends and neighbors. And when they get rounded up, the local citizens get up in arms. Now, it's easy to romanticize this. The local citizens don't go and free all the Ho-Chunk from U.S. custody. They just demand that the people we know on that boxcar be released. But they make such a fuss, and they interfere with the military in the course of its operations to the point that local officers are saying, do I have permission to fire on them? At which point, the federal government, dealing with a massive resistance to its military force in Southern Reconstruction, is absolutely unwilling to get into a shooting war with Wisconsin civilians, and tells the military to back off. Out west, where the Ho-Chunk have been deported to Nebraska, the Nebraska agent learns he has no military authority to hold them there, and so the Ho-Chunk begin returning to Wisconsin, almost as soon as they're deposited in Nebraska. They're led by people like one of the very few women whose name rises to the surface of the historical record that I have access to, a woman named Mary Crane, as well as by the descendants of people like Coming Thunder Winishek and Roaring Thunder. By 1875, so many Ho-Chunk people have returned to Wisconsin that the federal government kind of gives up. And it writes a little amendment into an Indian Appropriation Act that allows the Ho-Chunk to use their tribal funds gained in the treaties to buy land in Wisconsin. And by 1881, they're effectively recognized as citizens of Wisconsin. Some Ho-Chunk children are going to the local public schools, some Ho-Chunk men are voting. There's a complicated and tortured path from there to here, but effectively by the late 1870s, the federal government gives up because the Ho-Chunk have so successfully mobilized all of these constellation of forces to prevent their successful deportation. And so today, the Ho-Chunk exist in Wisconsin without a reservation in the way that we normally think of one, because their reservation is the homeland of the Winnebago tribe in Nebraska. But instead, on private homesteads and trust lands owned by the nation, spread out across a wide area of Wisconsin, and indeed the Wisconsin-Illinois border country, and in some areas in Minnesota as well. And as some of you may have been to Ho-Chunk powwows or other gatherings, continue to live and evolve as a people and a culture, have political representation. Representative Sharice Davids of Kansas is a Ho-Chunk citizen. To have community centers and civic centers, not just in Black River Falls, but also in Madison and other places. And even to return to Dejope and to begin staking out a kind of cultural foothold in my hometown now. This is a banner that's been flying over Bascom Hall intermittently over the past year, designed by our graduate student, Molly Paulette, a Ho-Chunk tribal member, that represents the 4 lakes of Dejope and the Ho-Chunk clan structure and a lot more besides. Imitating a kind of beaded bandolier bag, Ho-Chunk kind of traditional craft. And she's been speaking at convocation and at other events on campus, representing the kind of Ho-Chunk renaissance in my hometown. That's what I got to say. I'm happy to take your questions in a minute. Thanks for listening. So, what you got? Yeah.
You mentioned before about bluing and acquired land by Reedsburg and such, and I believe Yellow Thunder did something similar.
Yeah, Yellow Thunder did something similar, yes.
How many other examples of like that were?
So Yellow Thunder, Blue Wing, Peter Decora, I've seen a couple others. Those are the ones I know enough about to put a name to. There must be more.
That's one.
And the way we'd get at this is by like systematically going through property plats from the 1850s. I've done a little bit of non-systematic work in the General Land Office records. The federal government's records are all often very difficult to access and to use. The General Land Office is incredible. You can find out who patented what land forever, and who owned it subsequently, throughout the entirety of the American public domain. It's an amazing resource. And so a lot of the things I've found are on that there, including the Blue Wing patent, and a bunch of others too. But I have a senior thesis student who's a Ho-Chunk tribal member who I'm trying to get interested in that project for the 1860s and 70s. And he's very interested in it, but it's a very complex project. It's more like a PhD project than like a BA senior thesis project, so we'll see. Yeah.
The treaties of 1829, 32, and 35, were they really legal documents, or I mean, it was coercion, or
Yeah,
people were
37
signing
is the
but
third
didn't
one.
understand?
They are legal. So this is the complicated thing about U.S. treaties with Native nations is it's the form that the U.S. adopted for legalizing and legitimizing the transfer of title. And there are certainly examples of treaties in which formally you could say both parties are willing participants to this contract. I mean, a treaty is supposed to be a contract in those terms. But as we know, treaties are often signed at the end of a war. Treaty represents a cessation of hostilities. And there are very few instances in which the cessation of hostilities leaves the Native participants in a stronger position than the American participants. And the U.S. is unlikely to sign a treaty in those circumstances too. It's likely to keep fighting until it gets what it wants, which is almost always resources held, usually land, but sometimes mineral rights or other things, resources held by a Native nation. The why of this goes way back, like to the 1490s. I could do a whole riff about the doctrine of discovery and the sort of legal principles undergirding why it is that European powers feel that a coercive negotiation is nonetheless the form that one should employ here, but that's how it ends up being mostly. There are other contexts around the world where, like Australia, it doesn't work this way, right? New Zealand, it does. Like, yeah, right. So it can work out lots of different ways across lots of different sort of colonized parts of the world. But the treaty is the form that the U.S. adopted and held to throughout the 19th century, pretty much. And the treaties were kind of thought to be in abeyance for a long time until a series of political and legal fights by Native nations kind of demonstrated that, in fact, they were still the supreme law of the land, as the Constitution describes them, and that they couldn't just be countermanded because they were inconvenient.
Did we, or did the U.S. government violate those treaties?
Consistently. Yeah. I mean, like as a matter of course. But as the McGirt v. Oklahoma decision a couple of years ago suggested, just because it's been a tradition to violate them doesn't mean that the treaty still doesn't stand, right? And Justice Gorsuch writes at the beginning of that opinion, at the end of the Trail of Tears was a promise, and the promise was this land is yours in perpetuity, and Congress never undid that, so it's law, right? So it stands. Now, what that means in practice is a little more complicated, but still, I think we're still living in the treaty order. I think that's really important to understand. Like, the treaties are still living documents. The treaties with the Ho-Chunk don't have so much life in them in the sense that the reciprocal obligations that they promised to the Ho-Chunk have been discharged according to their terms. And so there's not much the Ho-Chunk can do with those treaties except, and I think this is crucial, say, you recognized us as a sovereign nation and we've never stopped being one, which is sort of the way that they have managed to reestablish themselves and regain federal recognition as the Ho-Chunk Nation here in Wisconsin. So, That's a really important part of it. Yeah.
When you use the word joke, what are you?
So Day-joke is a Ho-Chunk term. Day is lake, joke is four. So 4 lakes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I used to be able to count in Ho-Chunk, but I still can't do that. It's embarrassing for my teachers, for me or something. Any other questions? Yeah.
Was Canada involved with the Native people, the government in Canada?
Yeah.
Like our
Yeah.
government?
It's a very different story because during the entire period that Canada is doing those negotiations, it's part of the British Empire. It's the British Crown that's doing those negotiations. There are now, it's a system that looks similar in some ways, but it has sort of treaty areas rather than peoples for the most part, although there are some treaties with peoples too, especially in the sort of Canadian southeast. There's also a giant piece of kind of subarctic and Arctic Canada called Nunavut, which is kind of Canadian native territory, like a province of Canada that is a native province. But on the other hand, there's also a history of coercive practices of the boarding schools, which in Canada are called the residential schools, which were very much aimed at stripping away a native language, culture, identity, etc., and quite abusive in doing that over many generations. And Canada also kind of imposed a kind of blood quantum law on Native people, which some Native nations in the United States do and some don't. But that one of the things that happens with blood quantum as a measure of whether someone is a Native person or not is that as people intermarry, the average blood quantum of people in the tribe goes down, and at a certain point you end up with everybody in the tribe, even though culturally and historically they are members of the tribe, nobody meets the blood quantum level, and so the tribe ceases, legally speaking, to exist. It's kind of a ratchet. And Thomas King, who's a Canadian Native writer, said this is actually an effort to extinguish Native identity in Canada. And it will succeed unless they change the policy.
Is that still the policy?
As far as I know, that is the ratchet is still operative in Canadian politics. Yeah.
Do you know if the film that's being taken is going to be on PBS?
I don't, but there's one on PBS already.
Okay.
So if you search my name in PBS Wisconsin, you'll find a version of this talk.
This one will be on our YouTube channel.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I did one for. It was a while ago now. 2022 or something. Yeah. Yeah, before the book came out.
Nice.
Thank you, sir.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
I have some books if you would like to.